Have you ever thought that you have menopause, cortisol belly, or maybe you've been told that to lose weight, you need to fix your cortisol? If that is the case, you are in the right spot. I really want to talk about some of the lies that you've been told from a marketing standpoint to try and get you sucked into this weight loss conversation around cortisol. In this video, I'm going to talk about what's real, what's not, where the evidence comes from, and what you should be doing instead. So, I came across this article and I'm going to show you. So, this article came across my desk and it was an MD in gynecology reviews the top 5 supplements to tackle menopausal weight loss at its root to lose it and keep it off for good. And that feels really enticing, right? Like a doctor is telling me that if I take these supplements, I am going to lose menopausal weight at its root. So, first, I see this article. The first thing I think is my spidey senses are off, right? Obviously, there's some sort of promotional content behind here. Obviously, there is something that they're trying to sell you. Okay. So going into these articles, we have to look at that. Now, that's okay if there's something that they're trying to sell you if it works, right? So let's actually talk about some of the data. So this article goes on to talk about how once you enter menopause, losing weight becomes nearly impossible. And recent estimates by reputable institutions like Harvard should send chills down your spine because 2 out of 3 menopausal women gain weight. Meanwhile, 43% become obese during this life stage. That's without changing anything in their diet and lifestyle. Or even worse, despite sweating for hours and meticulously counting calories. That's why I want to talk about the following three things. What is the real root cause of unexplained weight gain during menopause? Why diet, exercise, and even HRT do not work during this life stage? Which 5 supplements can tackle the root cause of menopausal weight? Also, I will explain which one and why of these 5 supplements is my preferred choice. So I'm going to stop you right there. So, first, one of the studies referenced in this article has this image, and I wanted to bring it up because this looks at the weight gain during the menopause transition and the factors that are associated with it. So, first, we have hormonal factors, as you can see, a decrease in estradiol and estrogen, an increase in visceral adipose tissue, an increase in ghrelin, which is your hunger hormone. So, we have more fat tissue, we have less estrogen, we're hungrier, we have less testosterone, which impacts your muscle, and we have less progesterone, which does a number of things, but also impacts your ability to sleep. Then we have lifestyle factors. We have physical activity, diet, evening. No, I'm trying to zoom up here. Alcohol intake and smoking. Okay. Then we have age-related factors, decrease in resting metabolic rate, which is huge. We have a decrease in energy expenditure. We have an early onset menopause, decrease in lean muscle mass, subcutaneous adipose tissue. Really, it comes down to the fact that, yes, weight becomes harder to lose as you get older. There are a number of reasons why. Number one, the reduction in estrogen makes us more likely to be insulin resistant. Insulin resistance is more likely to give us cravings. It's going to upset those satiety and hunger cues. So you're going to be less full and more hungry, more likely to snack, more likely to hold your weight in that midsection, which increases your risk for cardiovascular disease. You're also going to have less muscle mass. As we age as females, your muscle mass declines every decade. We have less and less muscle mass, especially if we are not strength training to maintain that. And so as a result, less muscle mass equals it's going to be fat. You're going to feel flabbier. And that less muscle mass is going to reduce your metabolic rate. You're going to burn less calories at rest. If we layer on the fact that naturally, as someone gets older, they're less likely to do a lot of that NEAT, that non-exercise activity thermogenesis. They're not going to be walking around as much, doing laundry, chasing after small kids at that age, typically. And so that also reduces the amount of calories you burn. And so when we circle back to the fact, and I have these conversations with patients all the time, but when we circle back to the fact that we are quite literally burning less calories, you can understand why, and you see all of the hormonal and lifestyle reasons why we would burn less calories. You can understand why someone would gain weight if they didn't change anything with their diet and kept the same, right? Because in order to gain weight, you have to be in a calorie surplus. And over time, little by little, that reduction in muscle mass, that change in hormones, that reduced activity and energy expenditure, that increased cravings, it typically leads to not changing anything and gaining weight. And so I just want to talk about the very real reality that it is harder to lose weight because of all of those factors. When you're 20, you can just naturally do it because all of your hunger cues are aligned and you're more active and you have more muscle mass, and it just is what it is, right? So I want to get on to the next piece of this. So, what exactly causes unexplained weight gain during menopause? Contrary to common belief, even though this person has cited references that talk about all the reasons why you would gain weight, none of them include cortisol. But I digress. They're saying, contrary to common belief, it is not estrogen or progesterone. It's another hormone that also fluctuates in menopause, which most of my colleagues still overlook, unfortunately. When it's exactly what forces a woman's body to accumulate and retain fat, especially around the stomach. See, scientists from the University of Washington examined middle aged women for 15 years. After 5,218 observations, they clearly saw one common thing between them all. Their cortisol levels soared during the transition to menopause. And some of the studies that are shared to kind of reinforce these pieces have me confused. So, when it's exactly what forces a woman's body to accumulate and retain fat, especially around the stomach. So we go to the cited study here and we're going to share it. So this study is stress may cause excess abdominal fat in otherwise slender women. And so basically what they did is they're saying that cortisol affects fat distribution by causing fat to be stored centrally around the organs. Cortisol exposure can increase visceral fat. People with diseases associated with extreme exposure to cortisol, like Cushing's, have also excessive amounts of visceral fat. That's something we know. We know if someone has physiologically elevated levels, pathologically elevated levels of cortisol, they're going to have excess amounts of visceral fat. So basically, this study is saying everyone's exposed to stress, but some people may secrete more cortisol than others and may secrete cortisol each time they face the same stressor. So they predicted that reacting to the same stressors consistently by secreting cortisol would be related to greater visceral fat. And what was interesting about this is they actually looked at premenopausal, non-overweight women and overweight women. So they were premenopausal. And so we're also in this article correlating that all of this would happen in a postmenopausal woman, but the study that we're citing right here talks about a premenopausal woman. So I think that's important to note because these are going to be different. But basically, what they say is after the first exposure to stress, women with greater abdominal fat felt more threatened by the study's stressful tasks, performed more poorly on them, and then secreted more cortisol. They also reported more life stress. By the third exposure to stress, the lean women with abdominal fat still consistently secreted more cortisol in response to stressful lab tasks compared with women who had peripheral fat, which is just basically not that belly fat. And they're basically saying it is possible that greater exposure to stressful conditions or psychological vulnerability to stress has led them to overreact to stressors in their daily life. So they have a greater lifetime exposure to cortisol. And they're saying cortisol in turn may have caused them to accumulate abdominal fat. Genetics, however, also play a role in shaping reactivity to stress as well as body shape. Something that is kind of like left on the side as a oh yeah, by the way, we didn't actually prove that exposing these women to stress made them have abdominal fat. We just know that when they already have abdominal fat, they're more likely to respond in this way. And also, it could just be genetics and other things as well as their body shape. And so, here, the thing that we've cited doesn't prove anything. And then, in addition, they go on to say lifestyle and age may also influence levels of abdominal fat, smoking, alcohol, and lack of exercise. All contribute to greater abdominal fat. Postmenopausal women tend to carry fat in their abdomen due to changes in sex hormones. This author said a healthy lifestyle, including getting enough sleep, exercise, and relaxation, may reduce cortisol levels. Again, we know that it is due to hormone changes. This article is trying to tell us that it is not due to anything other than cortisol. Let's move on. So then they say, see, scientists from the University of Washington examined middle aged women for 15 years. After 5,218 observations, they clearly saw one common thing between them all: the cortisol levels during the transition to menopause. Let's actually pick this apart. So, they were actually looking at this study cited cortisol levels during the menopausal transition and early menopause. Observations from the Seattle Midlife Women's Health Study. Now, what we do know when we look at research is that cortisol does go up in menopause. My question and concern is this directly related to cortisol belly or menopause belly? And therefore, does treating that cortisol directly result in weight loss? Those are my questions. Those are my concerns, because this article is leading you to believe that cortisol is the problem and treating cortisol is the solution to managing your weight. That's the question we're trying to answer here. And they're using evidence saying it's 5,218 observations. Well, if you look here, we're actually doing, first of all, they're providing data. Women who weren't using hormone therapy or steroids, 132 women. Okay. So those 5,218 observations were from those 132 women. This is falsely making us believe it was a larger study than it was. First of all. Second of all, it was observational. If you know anything about research or data, you know that observational research does have a lot of nuance to it. And basically, their conclusions were that overnight cortisol levels. So they basically looked at a bunch of different data, menstrual calendars for staging their menopause transition stages, annual health reports, health diaries, and overnight urine specimens, which are looking at estrogen, FSH, and cortisol and their catecholamines. Okay. What they found is that overnight cortisol levels during menopause transition were associated with estrogen, testosterone, and FSH. In addition, they were significantly and positively associated with epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so basically, they're saying their conclusion was stage symptoms and their menopause transition stage, symptoms, and social, stress related, and health related factors had little relationship to overnight cortisol levels when other biological indicators were considered. So, this study was cited to prove the point that there was one common thing between them all: their cortisol levels. So you can see how this information is cited and research based, but heavily manipulated to try and prove the point that we're trying to prove in this unique and specific circumstance. So then we go on to say, when cortisol levels go haywire, I've seen many times what exactly happens after that during my medical practice, right? We're using that we're a doctor to again further prove our point that this is something that you should listen to. Elevated cortisol triggers a fight or flight response and raises blood sugar. We know that to be true. We know all that blood sugar gets stored as fat since there's no real threat. Your body starts pumping insulin out to prevent that. This causes insulin resistance, where cells can't take up energy efficiently. To put it simply, our body perceives a lack of energy and triggers irresistible cravings. This is the part that I don't think she highlights enough. Okay. And I'm going to get into that. But they gloss over it and say, at that exact time, it stores excess blood sugar as fat. This is why, or that's why, losing menopausal weight and keeping it off feels almost impossible. Here's why typical ways to lose weight make everything worse during menopause. In short, it's because not only do they not address the real cause of menopausal weight, but they actually further increase cortisol. Take weight loss diets, for example. As you already know, cortisol raises blood sugar, which is then stored as fat. So you gain weight even without a calorie surplus. So they're saying that you can gain weight by just having your cortisol elevated. We're going to get into the research so that you can see exactly what that is. What do most women then do? They further reduce their calorie intake, but scientists from the University of Minnesota and California found that to increase cortisol. In other words, strict diets can make you gain even more weight. So now let's go to this study that they're citing here. So we're looking at a study that was done in 2010 saying low calorie dieting increases cortisol. Basically, what they did is they looked at in a so monitoring versus not and restricting versus not, fully cross-controlled experiment, 121 female participants were randomly assigned to one of 4 dietary interventions for 3 weeks. Okay, 3 weeks, very short-term intervention. We see the monitoring and restricting condition track their calorie intake and restricted it to 1,200 calories a day. I'm going to pause there and say 1,200 is far too low and much more likely to cause a stress response in your body because you are under fueling significantly in the majority of women. Okay. Then we had a monitoring only, which tracked their caloric intake but ate normally. The restricting only was provided 1,200 calories of food but did not track. So they were given the 1,200 calories. And the control group ate normally and didn't track. Okay? So let's look at the results. So in this figure, we see that baseline, so this is cortisol output. We see that baseline, the people who did monitoring had higher cortisol than the people who didn't monitor at all. Obviously, it is more stressful to monitor your intake, depending on what they were using too, right? Like we can do this in non-stressful ways, but obviously it's more stressful to monitor your intake than not, okay? Then we look at restricting versus not restricting. We see cortisol going down and cortisol going up in the restricting, right? And let's go into some of the discussion points of this study that was referenced in this cortisol article. So, dieting is one of the most common behaviors used to control weight. This study suggests that dieting may, however, potentially be basically, they're saying it's going to impact your psychological well being. Specifically, this study that found that monitoring one's diet increased perceived stress and restricting your caloric intake, again, to 1,200 calories, increased your daily total cortisol. These findings lend support to the idea that stress may be a mechanism of diet failure. And if you've ever done a diet before, you can completely relate to this, right? You start restricting, you start under eating. Now you're feeling deprived. Now you're hungry. Now you have cravings. Now you're off the diet. You chuck it in the F it bucket, right? And then we see monitoring one's diet involve continuous recording of consumed food. Again, like if we're using MyFitnessPal or something similar, I can totally understand where this can go haywire because I personally hate it. I use apps that are easy, etc. We can get into that in another conversation. But you can see why people are feeling irritated, frustrated, feeling like it's impacting their quality of life. And we see that restricting your caloric intake can trigger mechanisms to reduce your energy expenditure. So we can essentially reduce cortisol, but when we restrict calories, we have a biological stressor, etc. So we know that the result of restricting to about 1,200 calories can increase stress. Again, I would love to see the same research that looked at a modest calorie deficit and not such an intense one. But what's also interesting is this is what they put in their own study. A critical and related question is whether that cortisol increase is likely to translate into weight gain. So, okay, let's say we restrict calories. Let's actually say we restrict calories to 1,200. Does that result in weight gain? Because that's what this article is telling us, that if you restrict to 1,200 calories, that equals more cortisol, which equals more weight gain, and that's why you gain weight. No studies to our knowledge have examined basal cortisol and weight gain longitudinally in humans, but experimental studies show a dose-response relationship between glucocorticoids and weight in rodents. So if we give animals glucocorticoids, they're going to gain weight, which if you've ever been on prednisone, you know that's one of the side effects. However, in a physiologically healthy human, we don't know if this causes weight gain. And so if we go back to the article where it is being cited, it is telling you that that's why you gain weight, because it actually, where does it say? This increases cortisol. In other words, strict diets can make you gain weight, which is why you try to exercise more. But the problem is that the University of North Carolina found that intense exercise increases cortisol by over 83%. That explains why diet and exercise can make you gain even more weight. This is going to transition us into her solution, which is supplements to treat cortisol for your menopause belly fat. But let's talk about all of the other pieces of the cortisol picture. So, the first thing I actually want to do is bring you through some of the research when it comes to cortisol and weight gain in women. Let's just paint the picture. Let's understand what this actually looks like. So, cortisol is a glucocorticoid hormone released by the adrenal glands in response to stress. It plays a role in your body's stress response and in regulating blood sugar and metabolism. We know that chronic elevation of cortisol has been linked to adverse effects on body weight and fat distribution. We know that women in midlife, particularly during perimenopause, often report weight gain, changes in fat distribution, and there is this growing information, quest into the role of how cortisol impacts these changes. So, let's just talk about some of the physiology so you can understand it, and then let's talk about some of the nuance, which I think is so much more important. Cortisol has many metabolic impacts that can influence weight and body composition. So cortisol helps mobilize energy. It increases glucose production. It promotes the release of fatty acids so we can take it from fat for fuel. And it reduces insulin sensitivity. You're like, oh no, this isn't good. Right. This action ensures that your body has available energy to handle that running from a bear. When cortisol remains chronically elevated, this can lead to muscle breakdown. This can lead to fat redistribution. So this is where we have the accumulation of fat viscerally around the organs and the abdominal region. A well-known extreme example is Cushing syndrome. And this is where we draw a lot of our information and evidence from, is from people with Cushing, okay? People who have Cushing syndrome have an excessive pathological amount of cortisol, meaning they've actually produced it in levels that is far higher than what the average person would. Okay. However, research in non-disease populations also supports a connection between elevated cortisol and increased abdominal fat. There was a study of healthy premenopausal women, and they found that these women with central fat distribution, so a high waist to hip ratio, secreted more cortisol when exposed to stress versus women with a low waist to hip ratios. I've already shown you that study because it was cited in the article. However, we didn't translate whether that caused accumulation or it was the other way around. Okay? We know that lean women with a tendency to store fat centrally actually have a high cortisol reactivity. These findings are potentially leading to the idea that stress or cortisol reactivity can contribute to central fat gain over time. They're basically saying that women who produce more cortisol under stress have more abdominal fat. But we don't know whether it's the chicken or the egg. We don't know if somebody has more abdominal fat, that can cause them to have more stress reactivity as well. We also know that chronic stress can stimulate your appetite for calorie-dense comfort foods, which creates a pathway to weight gain. And there is this stress eating cycle, and I'm sure you've experienced it before. Cortisol increases cravings for high sugar or high fat foods, leading to fat gain. That fat can then feed back and dampen the stress response. This reinforces the cycle. Now, let's talk about the midlife hormonal changes. Women transitioning through menopause have hormonal issues which impact cortisol dynamics. So, in perimenopause and menopause, we have a drop in estrogen and progesterone, but also changes with how the HPA axis, which controls cortisol, is regulated. Some women experience rising cortisol levels in that late menopausal transition. I've already noted that. We know that cortisol levels increase in that late stage of the menopausal transition. Intriguingly, this is actually not strongly linked to a woman's reported stress levels, but rather really much more related to the changing reproductive hormones. In this study, which I've already brought you through, high levels of FSH and estrogen and testosterone were actually associated with higher overnight cortisol. So we know that changes in how the ovaries are working can drive cortisol up, even if you're not feeling stressed externally. So one of these mechanisms can be that your cortisol binding production in your tissues can change. So estrogen can actually increase the levels of cortisol binding globulin in the blood, and it can raise total cortisol levels, We also know that estrogens can upregulate certain enzymes in your fat tissue, which can convert cortisone to active cortisol. So, as your estrogen's doing this, you can get changes in how your local cortisol is made within belly fat. And so this might tilt your body toward higher cortisol and more visceral fat. And this can be one of the many reasons why we have this abdominal weight or central fat storage. Again, we also have aging, reduced muscle mass, lifestyle changes that all contribute to menopausal weight gain. Now, one of the critical questions is, when we treat cortisol, does this cause weight loss without a calorie deficit, right? This is the age old question. Now, when we look at research, we see treating Cushing syndrome when we have a pathological level of cortisol, a level that's giving us like dangerously high amounts of cortisol. If we can bring those down, these people absolutely lose weight, even if they don't change their diet. Because we know that their cortisol is so high, the impacts of cortisol are absolutely the reason that they're gaining weight. Bring me back to that prednisone example. You're going to gain weight when you're on this medication that potentially is increasing that cortisol to pathological levels. Now, there have been a few studies looking at whether stress reduction can help weight control without dieting, and there is a little bit of controversy here. So, if you just quickly look at the research, you will see that lowering cortisol will help you lose weight. And a lot of people love that because they're like, if I can take something for my cortisol, this will reduce my belly fat. And this is what this article is trying to show you, right? This article is trying to tell you, take this cortisol lowering thing and you'll lose your belly fat because exercise and diet are making you gain weight. So, there was a study that looked at mindfulness-based stress reduction and mindful eating in chronically stressed overweight women. In this 4-month study, participants were not put on any calorie-restricted diet. They ate normally, but the intervention group had training in stress reduction techniques and mindful eating. The control group did not. Overall, the results were encouraging. The intervention did prevent weight gain compared to controls, despite no explicit dieting. Now, we actually did see that even though it just prevented weight gain, women in the stress reduction group achieved the reduction in cortisol output and saw biggest reductions in their deep abdominal fat when they did scans. So, reducing stress when they actually didn't lose any weight helped to reduce their fat, their body composition. And so, seeing the improvements in body composition is really encouraging. Now, stress reduction is not a rapid weight loss strategy. The changes in weight or fat were very modest and probably not noticeable, but we know that lowering cortisol can prevent stress-related weight gain. Typically, we're looking at this mechanism because lower cortisol is going to reduce stress-induced overeating. You're less likely to crave sugary or fatty foods. This improves your sleep. If we have poor sleep raises your cortisol and appetite. And this can reduce the tendency to store fat centrally. Okay. So there was a slight impact in doing that. Now, when we look at significant calorie restriction, the magnitude matters. I already mentioned this when we went through this. When we see a very low calorie diet, after about 1,200 calories, after 3 weeks, the women on the 1,200 calorie diet had a significant increase in their cortisol output compared to non-dieters. In fact, restricting calories had a medium effect size on raising cortisol. Now, interestingly, those who only monitored their food without cutting calories did not show a cortisol rise, but they did report an increased perceived stress. So this suggests that the act of restricting calories does trigger a stress response, while the self-monitoring aspect of dieting triggers that like psychological stress. So the cutting it super low makes you biologically make more cortisol, but just thinking about it can make you psychologically stressed. And so we do know that an extremely low calorie diet can backfire by elevating cortisol. Now, the question becomes, does a more modest calorie deficit also increase cortisol, or is this just a problem when we severely diet? So the answer is obviously not black and white. Magnitude matters. We know a very large calorie cut is a clear stressor, right? But a moderate deficit might not significantly raise cortisol. We don't have a ton of research on this, but they did look at a study in obese men. Over 10 weeks, they had a hypocaloric diet that produced about 2 pounds of weight loss per week, which is like a moderate deficit. And they found that before weight loss, these obese men had lower cortisol levels than lean men. And the reason why is because obesity can sometimes be associated with a blunted cortisol output. And so you're not making cortisol properly, your receptors aren't working. And what they found is after losing 9 to 10% of their body weight, these men's post-meal cortisol increased significantly, nearly reaching the level seen in lean men. So they're actually finding as body weight dropped, cortisol secretion rose. So they're seeing that weight loss, even at a moderate pace, can actually remove some of that inhibition on cortisol production. So they're basically saying that it's a feedback problem in someone who's overweight. And so the increase in cortisol might not cause the weight gain, but actually might just be a response to your body normalizing in terms of understanding those signals. So I just thought that was really interesting and really important to note that it's so nuanced when it comes to the reality of some of these things and some of these interventions. And so that is kind of part of the puzzle. Now we're going to go into a little bit deeper. Now, when we look at other types of evidence, not all moderate diets will show a cortisol change. There was a study, now this is on women, so I would say in this population with this conversation, this is actually a lot more accurate. There was a study on postmenopausal women, overweight or obese, 6 months of modest weight loss. So they lost about 8% of their total body weight through diet and exercise. This intervention combined a healthy diet with regular aerobic exercise, successfully reduced weight and improved metabolic markers without changing cortisol significantly at all. They found that fasting cortisol before and after weight loss remained about the same, and the cortisol response to a low dose, so they do a dexamethasone suppression test, basically to test your response, did not change. There was no change in your stress set point. So they're concluding that it's possible that the inclusion of exercise and the gradual nature of weight loss mitigated that stress response in the study. And so this is also important to note. Anything we do that's drastic is going to stress the body out. Okay. Now let's talk about the exercise component of things. So the article claims that when we do, high intensity exercise, that increases cortisol, which is going to make you gain weight. And it is true that acute exercise, especially high intensity or long duration exercise, causes a temporary rise in cortisol levels. Okay. Exercise is a physical stress. And cortisol is one of the hormones that helps us mobilize fuel during that stress. It does this by freeing up glucose and fat for your muscles. However, the context is critical. We actually see transient spikes in cortisol being normal and necessary part of the adaptive response. And this is very different from a chronic cortisol elevation due to ongoing stress. We know the net effect of regular exercise on the cortisol system is generally positive. And when we look at long-term exercise training, it actually tends to lower your baseline cortisol and improve cortisol regulation in response to other stressors. So let's break down the acute versus the chronic effects. When you perform intense exercise, cortisol typically rises in proportion to the intensity and duration of the workout. For example, a prolonged endurance exercise above a certain intensity will cause cortisol to increase and eventually it'll plateau and it'll have a higher plateau at a higher intensity. Very high intensity efforts can trigger a cortisol release, but sometimes the peak comes in recovery shortly after the exercise. So that acute cortisol peak is not bad. It helps maintain your blood sugar and blood pressure shortly and during exercise, shortly after and during, among other functions. When we look at research in animals, it shows that if we block cortisol release, an animal cannot sustain exercise for as long and becomes a lot more prone to hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, and exhaustion. So we actually need cortisol to exercise effectively. And after exercise, cortisol levels typically come back down over hours as part of your recovery process. Now, The more interesting part of this is what happens after you adapt to regular exercise. Your body becomes more trained and more efficient. One key adaptation is that giving exercise triggers less cortisol in a trained person versus an untrained person. So your threshold for inducing this cortisol response actually gets higher. Studies have found that fit individuals have a blunted cortisol response to a standard exercise challenge compared to sedentary. So people who exercise more are going to have less of that consistent stimulation. Additionally, your resting cortisol may be lower in those who are physically active. Some evidence suggests regular moderate exercise can slightly decrease your average daily cortisol. In a 2022 systematic review of exercise interventions, found that overall, physical activity was an effective strategy for lowering chronic cortisol levels. And that is really important because we know that exercise does so many important things for our health. Now, I will note that overtraining or inadequate recovery can flip the script. If you do a very high intensity exercise too frequently without enough rest, your body can start to show signs of chronic stress. And we can see this where your cortisol remaining high at rest. Now, this does not happen in a typical person. This is an extreme scenario typically seen in high level athletes, not someone who's just exercising recreationally. And overall, exercise tends to lower chronic cortisol elevations. And so, what I want you to take from this exercise conversation is that moderate exercise daily, even if it is HIIT training or cardio training, that is okay. If you have a wearable like a watch, that's a really great opportunity to look into what is my recovery saying? It'll give you a number of hours. And am I recovering properly in those number of hours? Or by the time I exercise again, am I still having those hours of recovery? How do I feel? Right? A lot of my patients won't do HIIT exercises because they're scared about their cortisol. But that is not something that is accurate. Okay. So, next up, I want to talk about cortisol and the actual mechanism of weight gain and weight loss. Okay, so then we go on to say the top 5 supplements to reduce cortisol and get rid of menopausal weight for good. So, it says before diving into these 5 supplements, I want to briefly discuss HRT because indeed it helps relieve some of the menopause symptoms. However, reputable institutions say that HRT won't help you lose weight. That is true. HRT does not have a direct effect on helping you lose weight. That's because this type of treatment supports declining estrogen, but it does nothing to lower elevated levels of cortisol, when in fact, it's the only way to lose menopausal weight. As you can see from this discussion so far, that is completely untrue. Now, let's actually talk about some of these things. So they're looking at 5 different supplements. Obviously, at the end, Bioma is the top of the list, and you can see at the end of the here we have a discount on Bioma, and it really tells you that it is the most cost effective. And here's the thing that I find interesting in all of these supplements. First of all, I don't dislike any of them. They're all fine. There's a few things that they're noting. Number 1, we have this product that contains phosphatidylserine, which lowers cortisol. However, the dose in the study was 8 times higher. And so their point is basically this is $440 a month to get the same benefit. It says nothing about weight loss. Then we have Flow Women's Endocrine Superfood Power. We have herbs. All these herbs are great. I use them in my practice. They lower cortisol by a stunning 42.4%. The effect was only short term. Again, no mention of weight loss. Then we have another one. We have a bunch of herbs. It gives you the dose. They lower cortisol by 28%. Again, nothing that speaks about weight loss. And if we pull up one of these studies, we have Withania, which is ashwagandha, which is a herb I love. And it does lower cortisol levels in stressed humans. This is a systematic review. And it does reduce it. But nothing talks about menopausal body weight. Now, I did search weight in this article, and we did see a slight reduction in overall body weight. I didn't go into the nuances of that, but the cortisol reduction itself was not the result of that. And again, if we look at the dosing, we'd have to be able to apply that to the product. In any case, this product or this article wants you to buy Bioma, and this is because it has bacteria, so probiotics. It's got a prebiotic, it's got a postbiotic, and that's that. So really, we're working through the microbiome to reduce cortisol. Again, I was just trying to find data that this product that they are trying to sell actually causes weight loss. Okay, so I want to start and kind of close out this conversation by really talking about the direct effects and the indirect mechanisms where cortisol can come into the weight gain conversations. So, excess cortisol is well known to cause weight gain. Abdominal fat, like I said, we see this in Cushing's. Cushing's is a condition of chronically high cortisol. Patients with Cushing's have central obesity, a moon face, fat deposition around the trunk, usually thin limbs, along with lots of muscle loss and metabolic disturbances. In Cushing's, cortisol levels are pathologically high. Often, we see several fold above normal. So, for example, we could have a urinary cortisol more than 4 times the upper limit of normal. And if we compare and contrast, everyday stress in the average person causes much smaller cortisol elevations within that normal range. Many obese or stressed individuals do not have overtly high blood cortisol levels. Often they are in the cortisol reference range. If we do blood work, it might be a tick above, but they certainly aren't 3 to 4 times the upper limit. And we see some individuals have subtle alterations, like we have a disrupted rhythm, an increased tissue cortisol production. But Cushing's is an extreme model of cortisol's effect on weight, whereas typical stress related cortisol fluctuations are milder and usually not enough to cause obesity on its own. So we do need to distinguish this context. If we look at it from a mechanistic perspective, cortisol can promote weight gain through multiple pathways. First, it can increase appetite and cravings, which can shift fat distribution to the abdomen and even reduce energy expenditure by breaking down muscle. Cortisol and stress hormones have been shown to potentiate hunger and cravings. Specifically, we're going to go towards more calorie dense comfort foods. And we know that under stress, people often experience stronger cravings for sweets, fatty foods, and snacks. This is stress eating. Physiologically, cortisol prepares the body for a perceived emergency by encouraging energy intake and fat storage. It binds to your glucocorticoid receptors on fat cells, especially in belly fat, which are more densely packed with cortisol receptors than your peripheral fat. We know that cortisol exposure stimulates enzymes like lipoprotein lipase, promoting fat uptake in adipose tissue. Combined with high insulin levels, which also accompanies stress-induced eating, cortisol helps shuttle those circulating nutrients into central fat stores. It also breaks down muscle protein, slows metabolism to conserve energy, and this chronically elevated cortisol can lead to loss of lean muscle and increased fat. These effects are what we see in Cushing syndrome, and to a lesser degree, we see this in chronically stressed individuals who have a visceral obesity, right? The bottom line is cortisol can create a hormonal imbalance that favors weight gain by increasing appetite, encouraging fat storage, and by reducing muscle and energy expenditure. So, with this in mind, the question remains, if we use something that's shown to reduce cortisol, do we see weight loss as a direct result? So, in cases of extremely elevated cortisol, so in Cushing's, we know lowering that pathological level of cortisol clearly causes weight loss, even without changing diet at all. When we block cortisol in Cushing's patients with a drug, they have a significant and sustained weight reduction. Okay? They can lose 7 to 10% of their body weight on average. Patients lose a significant fat mass and gain back lean muscle by 6 months. And with extended follow-up, patients maintain or even increase their weight loss over 2 years of continued therapy. Okay? So Yes, we see a massive change in someone who has a pathological cortisol problem. However, the situation is very different for the average person whose cortisol might be moderately elevated by daily stress, but not off the charts. So, in individuals without Cushing's, simply lowering cortisol does not melt away pounds. Most of the weight loss is lowering cortisol indirectly through changing behavior. So, through reduction in stress eating or improvements in metabolic health. So, better insulin sensitivity that can facilitate weight loss. So, let's look at some of the evidence. When we do short term pharmacological blockades in non Cushing, so basically what we did is we gave a glucocorticoid receptor agonist to overweight people, had no excess cortisol, but they had prediabetes for 9 days. Participants were kept on a controlled diet that wasn't a calorie deficit, it was isocaloric, it stayed the same during the trial. So basically, they didn't change anything about them eating, they just lowered cortisol pharmaceutically. The result was no significant weight change from blocking cortisol for those 9 days. And actually, cortisol levels rose as a reflex to us blocking the receptor, yet without a change in diet, body, or weight. So, what did change, which I found was interesting, is metabolic markers. So, using this medication to lower cortisol, we improved insulin sensitivity in the liver and fat tissue, which indicates a healthier metabolic state, even though the weight didn't move. And this study can help suggest that in the short term, reducing cortisol's effects alone doesn't directly cause fat loss unless it's coupled with an energy deficit. But it can actually help set the stage metabolically, improving the actions of insulin. And similarly, we've seen animal studies that show blocking cortisol can improve metabolism without changing weight when food intake is held constant. Rats on a high fat diet, given cortisol blockers, were shown no change in body weight, but had better insulin sensitivity compared to controls eating the same amount. Again, calories still reign supreme for weight change. In the absence of a deficit, lowering your cortisol won't magically make your weight vanish. Now, when we look at real world settings, cortisol reduction and stress management, we know that lowering stress and cortisol often does lead to weight improvements. This is because we're typically helping people eat better, adopt healthier habits, and we're creating a calorie deficit or preventing overeating by doing that. There was a randomized trial of it was an 8-week stress management program added to standard weight loss in obese adults. Both of the stress management group and the control group, which was diet only, were instructed on healthy eating and exercise. So they both achieved weight loss. But the group that did the relaxation techniques to lower stress and cortisol lost significantly more weight than the control group because the lower perceived stress led to lower cortisol levels, which may specifically have reduced the abdominal fat storage, right? Second, less stress likely improved participants' eating behaviors, and they were more likely to adhere to the diet. We know that high stress often causes people to choose convenience foods or snacks, mindlessly snacking, and we know that reducing stress can have the opposite effect, making it easier to stick to meal plans, avoid stress snacking. And in this study, the stress managed group had more improvements in diet quality and daily routines. They were more consistent with the idea that they were in control of their eating, which caused a larger calorie deficit, which caused more weight loss. Other weight loss trials have actually found similar results. We know that relaxation and mindfulness techniques by themselves don't cause huge weight loss, but they enhance weight loss efforts by curbing stress related lapses in diet. This underscores that for non Cushing's individuals, cortisol is a modulatory factor. Lowering it helps remove an obstacle to healthy habits rather than directly getting rid of fat cells on their own. And now there's growing research on supplements and lifestyle interventions aimed at lowering stress and cortisol. These are often known as adaptogens. Things like ashwagandha is known to reduce cortisol in chronically stressed adults. We looked at that study. In a double blind randomized control trial, they gave high concentration ashwagandha or placebo to 52 adults under chronic stress for 8 weeks. And the ashwagandha group saw 23 to 27% reduction in cortisol levels over 8 weeks compared to little change in the placebo group. The ashwagandha group also experienced notable weight loss relative to placebo, about a 3% reduction. This was about 2.5 kilograms on average versus about 1.1 kilogram in placebo. They also saw a BMI drop in the treatment group and improvements in well being. Now, they weren't put on any diet, they were living their normal lives. What they showed is that ashwagandha improved several stress related eating behaviors, significantly reduced emotional eating and uncontrolled eating scores on standardized questionnaires, indicating there were fewer bouts of overeating in response to stress. Subjects reported fewer food cravings and less tendency to use food as a coping mechanism. So we know that lowering cortisol and anxiety made them less likely to snack or mindlessly overeat, which naturally led to a mild caloric deficit and weight loss over time. The authors in this study concluded that weight reduction was driven by improved appetite regulation and reduced stress eating. So it wasn't that it was a stimulant or fat burning of the herb itself. This supports the idea that reducing cortisol helps weight management by removing that stress driven appetite surge. The weight loss still fundamentally comes from eating fewer calories than you eating fewer calories than you burn. And then we have mindfulness. Another study looked at mindfulness-based stress reduction for overweight women defined as stress eaters. Over 4 months, the mindfulness group did not lose a lot of weight overall compared to controls, but there was a pattern. Women who had obesity in the intervention group stopped gaining weight, whereas the obese women on the wait list who weren't in the intervention continued to gain weight. The intervention group, who we gave the mindfulness-based stress reduction program to, showed reductions in their cortisol awakening response, which is a measure of cortisol surge in the morning, when the people on the wait list stayed the same. Those who achieved the biggest drops in cortisol and stress reported the greatest reductions in abdominal fat by the end. Again, when we manage stress, we blunt excessive cortisol spikes, and that can halt further weight gain. Again, we're preventing stress triggered overeating and reducing cortisol's push towards belly fat deposition. While average weight gain doesn't dramatically drop, there was a trend of weight stabilization versus continued gain. This is a indirect mechanism. And so I think it's really important to put this into context. If we look at it in someone with Cushing's or very high cortisol, cortisol is the dominant pathological driver of fat accumulation. Lowering it causes weight loss even when we don't change the diet, because that is the major hormonal imbalance. The body resets towards a healthier weight when the flood of cortisol is stopped, reversing many of the abnormal processes, fluid retention, fat deposition, muscle wasting, that cortisol caused. On the other hand, in an average individual, cortisol is just one factor among many affecting weight. Most people with a few extra pounds do not have outright high cortisol. Their cortisol levels might be elevated from chronic stress and even look normal in lab tests. But for these people, lifestyle and diet are much more influential on weight than a moderate cortisol difference. Again, even normal range cortisol variations can make a difference on how weight is distributed and how hard it is to stick to a diet. People who are under high stress tend to have more trouble resisting high calorie foods and more difficulty sustaining weight loss behaviors because cortisol's effect on the brain reward system and hunger pathways causes this. Cortisol can enhance cravings for sugar and fat. Stress can impair self control. So, chronically stressed individuals may unknowingly eat in a surplus. And we know that chronically stressed individuals have been found to accumulate more visceral fat over time versus their less stressed counterparts. This is because cortisol directs fat storage to the abdominal region, and this is a well documented effect. There's also evidence that sleep deprivation elevates cortisol, can lead to weight gain by increasing hunger hormones and decreasing satiety. Managing stress and sleep helps people regulate their appetite better. And so, reducing cortisol can facilitate weight loss, but this is primarily by an indirect means. Curbing stress induced overeating, improving sleep and energy, and normalizing where fat is stored, all of which help create or maintain an appropriate calorie deficit. In individuals who have normal, common, everyday stress, taking this supplement that you read online that's going to lower your cortisol without any attention to diet or exercise is unlikely to produce any dramatic weight loss. The pounds don't magically fall off unless you're also consuming fewer calories or expending more energy than before. However, in a lot of people, cortisol reduction is often a hidden catalyst that makes weight loss possible and makes it sustainable. It gets rid of the hunger, cravings, and abdominal fat that high stress can cause. So, hopefully, you found this really helpful in making these decisions. At the end of the day, there is no magic bullet and everything is multifactorial. We need to take the information and use what's relevant to us. But weight loss is very much a multi systems approach that we need to look at the whole picture and make decisions that make sense for you.